Move to the top of today's order. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. House Bill 1097 has moved to the top of today's order. The House has before it House Bill 1097, which has been read. Mr. Chief Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, House Bill 1097 was introduced by Representatives Dolores Jones and other House and Senate sponsors. House Bill 1097 is a bill for an act to amend and reenact Section 12.1-30-04 of the North Dakota Century Code relating to Sunday closing laws and retail agreements, to repeal Section 12.1-30-01, 12.1-30-02, and 12.1-30-03 of the North Dakota Century Code relating to Sunday closing laws. Mr. Speaker, this has a fiscal note prepared by the Office of the Tax Commissioner. Their analysis indicates, if enacted, this bill may result in additional state and local sales tax collections. Mr. Speaker, your Industry, Business, and Labor Committee recommends due pass on House Bill 1097 by a vote of 11 yeas, 2 nays, and 1 absent not voting. Mr. Speaker.
Representative D. Ruby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, House Bill 1097, as you can see, is a pretty simple bill as far as how it's written. It basically is a repealer of the sections of code that relate to the limitations of sales, retail sales, in our state code. Mr. Speaker, may I continue?
You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the Assembly, I know that people have strong beliefs on this law. I myself have voted on both sides of this law in the past as they've come up. Last session I did speak in favor of the bill, and I'll be making some of the same points today for my reason to change my position on this. The majority of the opposition that we saw, of course, has been from churches and from people who have strong beliefs that this is a holy day, and that we need to limit the instance where people are going to be working on Sunday. And that is a concern for me. I don't like to require people to work, but I also don't like to require businesses to be told by the government when they can and can't be open. Now, the other issue with this is, of course, for a vast majority of the churches in North Dakota, Sunday is the Sabbath. But there's many churches where they go on Saturday or Friday. I've even heard some on Wednesday, but with probably the 3 largest ones, they basically will use one of those 3 days. So if we go along that line of thinking, God gets a 3-day weekend every week. So obviously, if we're trying to respect the Sabbath, we get into the conflict of whose Sabbath are we protecting. It was mentioned by representatives from my church that people need to have a day, whether it's any day. They didn't say it necessarily had to be Sunday, but they strongly believe that employees need a day off. And I agree. And so does our Century Code. And Mr. Speaker, I know you asked that we don't read on the floor, but is it okay if I read a portion of the Century Code?
Is there any objection? Without objection, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In our Century Code 3406-5.1, an employer may not require an employee to work 7 consecutive days in a business that sells merchandise at retail. An employer may not deny an employee at least one period of 24 consecutive hours at a time off for rest or worship in each 7-day period. And it goes on. You can look up that section and read the rest of it if you'd like. So our code still protects that time off. And people can get that time off on the day of their rest or their day of worship, either one. So I think that we're covered there. I think the current law that we have obviously picks winners and losers. There's many businesses that do operate on Sunday and sell and have employees. I myself have left church and went and had breakfast. And so there were waitresses who were working, and cooks and everyone else that was there. So that business was able to operate. But if I got done with that and went over to a retail store to pick something up before I left town, I couldn't. So I had to wait till noon. Obviously, with the exceptions we've also had, such as truck stops, where we have, they've become mini malls, but they're exempt. So if you have a craft store or a small souvenir store that is close to a truck stop, you can't open till noon, but they sure can sell everything you probably can sell in their place. So there's a real conflict, and I think it's not treating them fairly. The other argument is that the employees need the time to not be working during that time. Well, even in the retail places that can't open on Sunday, if you are in the parking lot waiting for them to open, there's people working there. And some of them came a lot sooner than just opening time. So we're really, our law does not stop people from working. It does not prevent people from working. It just stops us from shopping. So I think that if the goal is to require people not to work during those times, then the law should have been changed to prevent that, but it didn't. So at the end of the day, I don't think that the current law is working. I think it is, like I said, picks winners and losers, and it's time probably that we just change the law and then allow businesses to decide when it's best for them to be open and closed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there any discussion? Representative Kay Koppelman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pardon me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly. I rise not to debate the bill, not to tell you how to vote on the bill. That's a matter of conscience, and I suspect that each one of you will vote according to that conscience today. And like Representative Ruby, like the bill carrier, I have voted on this bill several times before, as have many of you that have been here for a while. And I find myself agreeing with everything he said in the beginning of his floor speech, which was that he doesn't like to require people to work on a Sunday or a different time when they feel for religious reasons they don't want to do that. And then also that he doesn't like the government to tell businesses when they can and cannot be open. And I agree with him completely. That's why this bill has always been a struggle, I think, for a lot of us. However, he also read a section of the Century Code which presumably or ostensibly protects religious liberty. And I would submit to you, members of the Assembly, that it really does not, because if you read the rest of that section of the Century Code, there's an exception that you could drive a truck through, and that creates a loophole, so that section really becomes moot in terms of its operation. I just want you all to be aware, as you vote on this bill, that there is another bill that's been introduced that will actually strengthen that section and strengthen the religious liberty protections that we give people so that they can have the freedom to observe their religion, whether that's on a Sunday, on a Saturday, on a Friday, whatever it might be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Hoverson.
Thank you, Speaker. May I ask a question of the presenter and then also give reasons after that?
Representative Ruby, would you yield to a question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I will.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Hoverson.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Ruby, would I be in order to ask, do you know, or does anybody know why it was moved up today? This bill was moved up to the top.
Representative Hoverson, that question would be out of order.
Okay, thank you. My reasons for encouraging a no, I realize that a lot of you have been through this before and you've made up your mind, but I also have talked to some that have said, either way, it doesn't really matter to me. So I guess I'm maybe more talking to you as well. First of all, we keep referring to the awkwardness of the law, but I don't consider it fair to use the 1991 awkward compromise against the Sunday Blue Law. The creator of our preamble, the Almighty God that we refer to in our thinks differently. He designed many things along with the 7-day week, life, gender, and our society continues to try to improve on those things. I don't know that it's such a good idea for us to try to improve on what's been designed. That's not even a religious statement. That's just simply recognizing the truth of how things are designed. Also, almost every founding father of our country disagrees with this approach to not having some sort of Sunday closing. So it's a matter of we're the most free when our laws match the way things really are, when they line up with the truth. And so I did a poll about a month ago. It's unscientific. It's not real large, but at least a poll. And I think any poll, even if it's unscientific, represents a certain segment of North Dakota. And I found that over 95% of the people don't want this repealed. I really wonder if we have listened to the people, maybe a few sections of people, but it would be really interesting to say no to this and take the time to actually see what North Dakota thinks. I'm only going to refer to 2 studies. I have backup if anybody wants to see them. There's many studies, many Supreme Court cases. I'm only going to give 2. One is that when Commerce already had 6 days, 1991, they got 6.5. The government does have a role to play because they're the only ones that can play this role. And that is if Commerce gets every single day and the church has none, it does have a statistically proven reduction in every state, and that was done by Notre Dame and MIT in 2008, and I do have that study. I can back that up. Also, I want to share another one. It's actually kind of a fun one, but it's a great researcher. If you've heard of George Barna, this guy's even more of a researcher than him. It's excellent research. I found this out a few years ago that they calculated through their polls and surveys that you can divide up our nation into 4 groups of people, roughly 25% apiece. The strong churchgoer, which, by the way, this bill isn't going to affect them, and the just never going to go, don't believe in this stuff, it's not going to affect them. But there is 50% in the middle, and our culture is what's changed in the middle. The attendance or not attendance hasn't. But the attitude toward the church has, in the 50% in the middle. There's a movie that reflects that difference. And that is, do you remember the Ghostbusters of the 70s? Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd? Well, in that movie, they're going after the ghosts, and there's a marshmallow monster. This is in the 70s, and it's coming through town, stepping on buildings, and it steps on the church. And Bill Murray, who we wouldn't consider a strong church-going person, who knows where he's at regarding that, but he represented the culture of that 50%. And when the marshmallow monster, Stay Puft, steps on the church, Bill Murray says, "Hey, nobody steps on the church in my town," and then the Ghostbusters go after him. And I think that was the attitude back then towards the church. Even thieves and robbers didn't mess with the church. And so I think today we have an opportunity to let North Dakota be different. We've attracted many people through oil money, which I think is great, but we aren't paying attention to the social fabric of North Dakota. I believe that we've attracted human traffickers, we've attracted drug dealers with money, but how about attracting some people that actually appreciate the Sunday laws, appreciate the wholesomeness that comes with that, and the virtue. We can't improve on God's design. As much as we try with life, we're trying with gender, and we're trying with the days of the week. So if you're in the middle, or if it doesn't matter, I guess I just appeal to you that you would side with the church on this one. Vote no on 1097. Thank you, Speaker.
Representative Leaning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would imagine some of you remember a statement I made during our last session, which I'll try not to repeat. I had numerous responses to that. But as our carrier expressed, rest is needed by individuals. And right now we've restricted, we used to have the entire Sunday set aside, and there were very limited businesses open. We've shrunk that down to 1/2 a day on Sunday. And many times we brag about how North Dakota is #1 in many things. My understanding is that North Dakota is the only state that has a blue law remaining on the books. I think we should stay number one in that case. Something to think about. We mentioned restriction of government over people. There are many, many areas where government restricts people. If you go down the highway, I think you'll see speed limit signs. That's a restriction on what you may want to do. If you have a little hot rod like mine, I'd like to run 100 plus miles an hour, but I avoid that because you wouldn't see me here very long. But at any rate, I don't think the argument that government restricts you is necessarily a good one in this case. We do need time to rest. We're talking about a half a day here, and I doubt very much that the business difference would be that great that you're going to see a significant improvement in sales tax or anything of that nature. I think that half day should be set aside to recognize that we all do have a creator, and he's the ultimate lawgiver and the ultimate law controller. And I don't think it hurts North Dakota to remain in that position to recognize that. With that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you. Vote no, by the way.
Representative Twite.
Mr. Speaker, I rise and agree with the two previous speakers, but I'd like to carry it a bit further. As I look around this assembly, there's a number of us that have been in the military. And I'm sure you remember how we could go to church on Sunday when we were in the military. You could go if you brought the bulletin back so you could show it to your squad leader or the first sergeant or whoever was over you. However, there was usually some repercussions down the way, whether it was lack of a promotion or whatever. I often wonder, our carrier talked about being able to have that 1 day a week off out of the 7. You're not guaranteed that's going to be your Sunday to go to church or spend with your family. And as a previous employer, I tried to treat my employees fair, but I'm not sure all employers do the same thing. And I speak for the employees today that do deserve that day of rest and do deserve that day of worship. And yes, we've already opened the gate. We've let some out that have to work, but let's not make it any more than it is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Damshin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, the blue laws, don't tell anybody they have to go to church on Sunday morning, and they don't tell you can't work. But I don't think that repealing them is going to be a real economic boon to anyone. I don't really know the reasoning behind that seeming so important. It isn't like the government is being more intrusive, or that they were more intrusive when the original blue laws were put in place. I think it was probably a much more conservative bunch of people than we have now. So I don't think that's a concern. For me, it isn't anyway. I guess what I think is important about keeping our blue laws is that we can set aside a little time away from our everyday normal activities, busy lives, and show a little respect for the principles that our founders built our country on. So I'd hope you'd consider voting red on this one. Thank you.
Representative M. Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the House. As the owner of a retail establishment, I have a significant conflict of interest on this bill and ask to be excused from voting on it.
Representative Lauser.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Representative Nelson be allowed to vote on this bill.
Question is on the motion of Representative Lauser that Representative Nelson be allowed to vote on this bill. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Representative Nelson, you may vote. Representative Scraw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly. When deciding how you will vote on this bill, I ask you to consider these things. I grew up at a time when there was actually a day set aside every week called Family Night. Through the collaboration work of school districts and families, Wednesday evenings were set aside to carve out free time when parents and children could have relaxing time over a meal around the dining table. This time was established by the recommendations of child and family experts for the good of the family and for the building of relationships. I ask my fellow representatives, what day is there where there's likely to be free time anymore? It's Sunday. How do you plan major holidays with schedules so tight and you're trying to juggle work, school activities, meetings, community activities, etc.? What day do you choose? Thanksgiving and Christmas are the most heavily traveled days of the year as loved ones come home to gather and celebrate. For many families, it is the nearest Sunday. And if we choose to celebrate on Saturday, we do so to allow loved ones to travel all day Sunday in order to be back home for Monday work obligations. Congress changed the national calendar, placing the national holidays, many of them on Mondays, to create a 3-day weekend for the good of the people. What day are you or your employees most likely to request off? It's Sunday, the most universal day to schedule birthday parties for your kids and your grandkids. The closest Sunday to the big day. President George Washington, our founding father, understood the value of a day off, not wanting his federal postal employees to work too hard. He established a mandatory day of rest for them. He chose Sunday. He demonstrated great wisdom and understanding of the human person in this. There are incredible benefits for taking downtime. We need time for R&R, for rest, recovery, regeneration, relaxation, restoration, recreation, relationships, and reflection. Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, as I serve on the Human Services Committee and hear the testimony of all the devastation resulting from broken and failing families, I can't help but wonder if lack of such time is a root cause. You may have heard some say, well, there's so little left, a remnant of the Sunday closing laws. Why bother trying to save it? It is this very body that for years have allowed the undermining and chipping away of its provisions. I want to reemphasize a statement made by a previous speaker. North Dakota is unique in being the last state with Sunday closing laws still in place. It also has the honor of being the happiest state for a family to want to raise their children. It is the #1 state where people want to live. We should not change that. Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, when I consider all of the above-mentioned benefits that we receive from a day of rest, especially a universal day of rest, we should rather be making efforts to restore this day of rest. And so, Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, for the sake of our well-being, for the good of our families and our state, we must not strip the last remnants of the North Dakota Sunday closing laws. I urge you to vote no on House Bill 1097. Vote red.
Representative D. Ruby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly. I just wanted to clarify, because I know there's been some comments made about more commerce on Sunday, more profit. And as you remember, I did not use that as one of the reasons. I don't think that would be a good reason for that. I think there's just the flexibility for business to be able to open a little earlier when their customers are actually showing up. So the main point that I was making is the flexibility of the employer to open when people want to shop. He already has his employees working there. So all of the discussion and compassion for the employees to be home and to have the day off is great. But in reality, our law does not provide for that. And I understand everybody. I don't think anybody that is here that in this body that wants to go to church and is going to change your mind and go shopping right away instead of church. I don't think, but there's a lot of people out there that while you're in church are heading to work, but you can't shop in the stores. So the law really does not accomplish in hardly any way the intent of what these people that are here that are passionate about this have.